Good evening, and welcome to the Committee of 100's conversation on affordable housing. My name is Shelley Repp. I am chair of the Committee of 100 on the federal city. The committee was formed over 100 years ago to sustain and safeguard the fundamental values of the L'Enfant and Macmillan plans that give the nation's capital much of its distinction, beauty, and rich community character. Today, our all-volunteer members are active citywide on a wide variety of issues, including affordable housing, land use planning and zoning, climate change, transportation, historic preservation, and open space conservation. A booklet describing our history is in the lobby on the counter toward the back. Feel free to pick one up and take it home with you. During 2023, our centennial year, we decided to mark that milestone by holding a series of what we called conversations that focused on some of our city's challenges. These were so successful that we continued them in 2024, focusing on downtown, and now in 2025. These have all been recorded and can be found on our YouTube channel. Information about how to access that channel is included in the program, which each of you should have. We have three speakers this evening: Professor Patrick Condon, Patrick McAnaney, and Yona Freemark. I will provide a brief intro for each before each of them speaks, but more complete bios are included in the program. We've reserved time for questions after our three speakers have spoken. To ask questions, you'll have to line up during the question period, line up near the mic here at the center of the stage. Please keep your questions brief. We want time for everybody to ask questions, but more importantly, some people take a lot of time, basically making long comments, and that's not what the question period is about. If you want to have comments, please let us know afterwards, and we can talk to you about them. The moderator for the question period will be Vince Morris, media critic for the Washington City paper. Locally, he served as a spokesman for Mayor Tony Williams and on Capitol Hill for Senators Bernie Sanders, Barbara Mikulski, and John Kerry. He has worked as a newspaper reporter for 15 years in D.C., New York, and North Carolina. After the program, please join us for refreshments in the lobby. We'd like to talk and converse with all of you at that time. Committee 100 members are identified by the badges like the one I'm wearing right here. And we invite you to talk to any of us to learn more about our organization. We welcome new members, including new members that are interested in housing, because we'd like to beef up that committee. Okay, enough for my introduction. Now to the speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Patrick Condon. Professor Condon currently teaches at the University of British Columbia, where he holds the James Taylor Chair in Landscape and Livable Environments. Of particular significance to us, Patrick has written a recently published book entitled Broken City: Land Speculation, Inequality, and Urban Crisis. I'm sure you will find his work most interesting. Please welcome Professor Condon.
Thank you. I need one of those slide advancers. So somebody is out there with one, I'm sure. But perfect. Whoa. I was told it had a laser pointer. Yes, it does. So thank you for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. This is great. I haven't been to Washington in 20 years. I grew up fairly close to here in relative terms. I'm in Vancouver now, but I grew up in the city of the wonderful city of Brockton, Massachusetts, not too far from here, a world away in some ways. But I find it kind of important when I talk about, basically this is a book talk, and I find it kind of important when I talk about the book, tell a little bit about who I am. So I did grow up in Brockton, and my orientation to this work has been basically around creating housing that's affordable and wonderful for citizens at every income level. So that's kind of who I am ideologically. And I've only got one message, and I want to start off by making it really clear. I love density. I think we ought to add density to a lot of American cities, almost every neighborhood, in one way, shape, or form or another. And I have done that myself in the city of Vancouver over the course of 33 years. So most of my work is of that guy who encourages cities to become more sustainable by adding density, so there's more customers for local commercial spaces. There's more people to get on the bus. There's more opportunities for different housing types within a neighborhood, so they're not all homogenous. So that's basically who I am. And I've done a lot of this housing stuff over the last 33 years, as my gray hair attests, and I've been very disappointed at the end of my career. I'm retiring in a couple months. At the end of my career, to find out that all of my efforts and the efforts of all hundreds and perhaps thousands of people within the area that I've done most of my work, which is the Vancouver area, which we thought would lead to more affordable housing, among other things, did not. It actually correlated with the housing in the city of Vancouver and indeed the rest of the region being the most expensive housing in North America. So basically it was a question of why. Why didn't it work? Why didn't it work to add all that density in various ways, from towers to granny flats to rear lane houses to duplexing and fourplexing through rezoning neighborhoods, all the things that we all wish would work to make housing more affordable. Why didn't that make housing affordable? And the bottom line is this: unfortunately and very sadly, it ends up not being the building that costs too much, it's the land under the building that costs too much. And adding new density inflates land price, unfortunately. Like when we take $1 million lot and we say you can put 4 houses on it, in many cases, what happens is the $1 million lot, the land ends up costing $4 million. So the purchaser doesn't gain the advantage. Unfortunately, it's the landowner. And indeed, the land speculator. I tell my students, if you want to make millions, become a land speculator, because that's where the real money is, passive income. So all these other books that you see up here, I work with communities to do these kinds of communities sustainable, walkable, all those good things. And got a little bit more aggressive when I did 5 Rules for Tomorrow's Cities, looking at what global cities across the world are going to need to do in order to accommodate the violent changes in their urban landscapes that they're experiencing, and ending up here with a book that's really mostly about, almost all about the problem as has been defined by not just me, but me and a few others. I gotta take some of this water. Excuse the interruption. I feel like Marco Rubio. And it ended up with this one here, Broken Cities. So that's what I'm talking about tonight. But a little bit more about me. One of my projects in Vancouver is very illustrative. This community for 5,000 people, just flash a few slides. It's kid-friendly. We had protected riparian areas. We had commercial services in walking distance, stormwater naturalization, schools within walking distance. Kind of unusual in the suburban landscape. Neighborhood parks within a 2-minute walk, a variety of house types. Not the most beautiful picture, but we did have rental units scattered throughout within the principal residence, and somewhere on the rear lanes, which were very crucial. Rear lane architecture was a really crucial part of the strategy to get affordability. Separated bike and walking paths. On and on. Here's another admission I need to make. I am an empiricist. I'm not a theorist. I don't have a PhD in real estate economics, but I am a scholar. And my scholarship is in the realm of empirical examination. So everything I'm about to tell you that goes into the book is really based on observation rather on economic theory, except for one exception, which I will mention, the economic theory having to do with land. And I have concluded it's always about urban land and how it absorbs the value of all the good works we do above, benefiting the land speculator and unfortunately not benefiting our sons and daughters and our grandchildren and the service workers who we want to keep in our cities, who are increasingly being forced to flee from our center cities over the course of the last 2 decades. And in Vancouver empirically is the best example of what I'm talking about in North America. In Vancouver, why didn't adding tons of new density to existing neighborhoods lead to affordability? That's the question we were asking. It was heartbreaking, really, that it just kept getting more and more expensive. This is how bad it is. You only have to look at a couple lines. This is salaries. Watch the bouncing ball. And this is the cost of housing, essentially. So there's a lot of numbers here. There's tons of information. What it basically says is you used to be able to afford a home in the 70s and into the 80s, but now you can't because the gap between your salary and the cost of the housing has increased. Housing has increased on a per square foot habitable basis, while salaries have stayed stubbornly flat. Of course, this information you're looking at is adjusted for inflation. So this is inflation-adjusted real income and real house costs being shown. Maybe you've seen some of these pictures. This is the most dramatic one that is seen by many people around the world. On the top, that's Vancouver as it was in basically 1985-ish, 83, 82. And this is what it was by the mid-90s or the year 2000. So a huge, and all those buildings, of course, are all residential. So that was all residential fabric brought in. And at the beginning of that, me and others were very pleased with this phenomenon because it did, in fact, reverse the migration of the middle class to the suburbs and provided a product and a neighborhood type that was attractive enough and at a price at the time that could be afforded to bring people back to the center city, which is necessary for sustainability reasons. It has a lot of good things that come with that density. And in the case of Vancouver, one of the good things that came with that density was a beautiful public realm below those buildings. So of course we were all proud of it. And of course we all celebrated that we doubled population. Actually, it was only 75%, so I'm bragging a little bit there. Doubled population, we did double density, and we tripled the number of housing units citywide since 1970. All through infill. This is an important point because the debate these days is about we need to add new housing to the suburban single-family neighborhoods should go, and I'm in favor of them going, but if the only reason that you're doing it is to get affordable housing, you're going to be disappointed. That's not the way it works. So, some data. Way on the left is Vancouver, showing you basically the same data. That Vancouver with the blue line, that's housing units, and the population is the brown line. Just to give you an American example, San Francisco here added only 30% to their housing. So Vancouver is in a class by itself almost entirely. The other one is the ones that are sort of close are Victoria and Toronto, which unfortunately are having similar affordability problems at the same time. So it contradicts the idea that what we have is a housing crisis fed by lack of supply. You hear that all the time. Lack of supply. We need more supply. If we have more supply, prices will go down. It's economics 101. Empirically, that's not the way it is working. I'm sad to say. This is another view that gives you even more complexity in the same kind of information. Here's Vancouver way out beyond, and this axis here is affordability, and this axis here is density. Vancouver, the Canadian cities are shown in the red, and the American center cities. This is not metropolitan regions. That's very important. These are center cities, like New York City is a center city. Boston is a center city. Dedham, Massachusetts is not Boston. So we looked only at center cities which are receiving this infill demand, and rightly so in some respects. And what you see is a correlation. Affordability becomes more and more impossible as you add supply. That seems to be the correlation. And I don't think you've seen a chart like this before, because the reason why I did it was because I couldn't find one. There should be one. There's a very obvious way of thinking about what the hell is going on. San Francisco, Vancouver, yet again shown. So if adding new density, new supply brought down housing prices, Vancouver should have the cheapest housing in North America. It has the most expensive housing in North America, measured by the gap between median household income and median price for the median home. The most expensive. One more time. Okay, thank you. I think I got one swallow left. I think that'll get me through to when they bring out the hook and get me off the stage. And it begs the question, why? Why didn't it work? If it's not a question of supply and demand, what is it? What is it a question of? So the book basically says it's a question. The answer to that question is that urban land has a capacity of absorbing all the good stuff in its price that goes on above it. All the things that the entrepreneurs and the wage earners are doing above eventually gets reflected in the price of the land underneath our feet. This is my favorite graphic that shows continental United States values, and if it's red, it's $1 trillion or more. So you can see where all that money stacks up. Basically in the so-called Northeast megalopolis, Florida, and all throughout California, and a little bit up into the West Coast, up to Seattle. But it's more instructive. This is the counties. It's showing you county lines across the United States. It's more instructive if you see this. It gives you a sense of the massive amount of wealth that is in urban land. And this is an increasing amount. This is 200-300% more value in urban land than just about 20, 25 years ago. It's a massive shift. which is not being really recognized. And it lands on the important center cities, what me and other people call global cities, like Washington, D.C. is certainly the preeminent global city in the United States, for sure. Also included as a global city would be San Francisco. And here's the trajectory of San Francisco urban land against the trajectory of all other urban lands in sorry, in the United States. So, point being, global cities are getting beaten up bad, and people are having to leave these cities because they can't afford to live there. It's creating economic development problems and so forth. And here's a very simple diagram that talks about land price inflation. I mentioned this before, so I can speed through it. It's the same land price at the beginning is 1 million, then it goes up to 4 million. While, and this is the key thing that this slide is talking about, while the price per interior square foot of this original building is about $1,000 a square foot in the city of Vancouver, after, the price per interior square foot of this building is also $1,000 per square foot. And what we're really talking about when we talk about land price in the parlance of developers, the land price is really bought and sold based on what they call per square foot buildable. It's not sold per square foot of dirt. It's sold per square foot of buildable allowance that the public allows that land to contain. So when we rezone, with a stroke of a pen, we're creating massive shifts of wealth towards whoever is lucky enough to own that land. Now, a lot of that land is presently owned by people my age, and I see some of that same cohort in the audience here who bought into their homes in the 1970s and 80s for a reasonable price. Suddenly they're on top of like $2 million. They too don't want to see that land price go down. So politically, there's a huge issue around the politics of doing anything to interfere with. Most people call it real estate price, but I'll show you why it's really land price that is an issue here. So it's sold in Vancouver, the $1,000 per square foot home is typically $600 just for the buildable allocation, the allowance on that site. So to build a home in Vancouver, a wood frame building up to 6 floors is about $220 a square foot, but you have to pay $600 just to get to the land, and upzoning that same parcel of land doesn't fix the problem, because when you do that, the price goes back up to $600 per buildable square foot. How am I doing on time? Anybody know? 6? Vancouver is one of the few municipalities that has all this charta that shows you the relationship between land price, which is the blue for any parcel, and the building value, which is the green. And these two are shown to you together to show you it doesn't make any difference, really. If you have a single family home or a much denser project, you would hope that the denser project would dilute the land value, but the ratio between building value and land value stays roughly the same. So for your edification, I've got a couple of examples. You don't have such an elegant thing showing what the difference is, so I had to resort to this, which shows you, here's an empty lot in this location here. You might fault me a little bit because I don't know the exact geography, but the two that I'm going to show you are only like 6 blocks apart. And so this is for this lot, no building on it. And a virtually identical price a few blocks away for a lot with a building on it. What's the message here? The message is that the building is worth nothing. The land is worth everything. The land is worth everything here. What can be done about land price? My only practical suggestion, there's huge political problems to pulling this off. There's very huge lack of consensus about what I'm talking about. The consensus, the position you hear most often is the supply and demand position, and we just have to build everywhere, and everybody should get out of the way. But if you do that, here's the same building, and if you get rid of impact fees, this is the taxes that are usually applied to new development for new pipes and maybe a new library and various amenities. If you just get rid of that, as many people are recommending, all that happens is the land price residual element goes up. But in Vancouver, we were able to capture what the local parlance was called land lift, basically a tax on development that captures 80%. That's why Vancouver looks so cool when you go there. We captured 80% of the new value of the rezoned land, and it went to build this crazy, crazy great park system. It went to build a number of community centers, historical restoration, in this case, of the roundhouse, the original rail lands, and non-market housing of various kinds. Second example, closer to home, Cambridge, Massachusetts, a few years ago, they rezoned the whole city. So there are two ways to use zoning that I've described. One is just to rezone and hope for affordability. Cambridge rezoned and insisted on affordability. It said you can double the density anywhere in this city, whatever the existing density is there, just multiply it by 2, and you can get your new building approved. But in return, it has to be 100% affordable, based on 30% of monthly income for the region's median household or below. That's the HUD definition I've just given you. And they're getting stuff built because the land price doesn't inflate in this circumstance. It stays stable. I'm an urban designer. That's really what my passion is. So I'm particularly proud of the fact that they were able to convince neighborhoods that a doubling of density using prototypical and in many cases traditional architectural typologies convinced neighborhoods to accept this density. And the reason why neighborhoods accepted this density was my daughter was on the Cambridge City Council for a few years, so I speak from her experience, was those elder citizens who were owning all that land essentially were persuaded that something that would create housing that was affordable for their sons and daughters and the service workers that they needed to keep in their community, and they would accept a doubling of density. They would welcome a doubling of density. That might be a little overstated. They would welcome a doubling of density in return for the availability of housing that was affordable for their sons and daughters and service workers who needed to stay in the community. And I think I can wrap it up there. Bottom line, don't just upzone hoping for affordability. Insist on it. Insist on it. That's the only thing I can recommend short of a revolution.
Well, thank you, Professor Condon. Very illuminating. Our next speaker is Patrick McAnaney, the Development Director for Washington, D.C. for the Somerset Development Company. Somerset, which is based here in D.C., is in the business of producing affordable housing. Patrick is going to ground us in the costs, financing, and need for public support in providing affordable housing. Please welcome Patrick McAnaney.
Evening, everyone. I am the other Patrick. So my presentation today is going to focus a little bit on affordable housing. As Shelley mentioned, I'm an affordable housing developer. And so really the goal of this presentation is to kind of building off of the point at the end, talk about how we actually do produce affordable housing, what it costs, what are some of the tools we have available to get dedicated affordable housing. I know obviously some of the conversation here tonight is about supply, so I do want to talk a little bit generally first about kind of housing market trends nationally. And then I'll get into the kind of math of everything, how you finance construction projects, how that works for dedicated affordable housing specifically, some of the tools that are available to cities in order to fund those, and then a little bit about how the development process works in general timelines, as well as some of the emerging challenges we have right now in the affordable housing world. So overall, the key thing is we've actually just gone through a really unique period of national price trends. Obviously, we've just gone through an inflation shock in the whole country, and housing is a big part of it. This here is the Case-Shiller Home Price Index, our best national index of home prices. What you can see there is we were having, about a 5% inflation for home prices before the pandemic. That obviously surged. We were at about 20% home price inflation for a while, and now it's dropped back down to 5%. So we've kind of come past the worst of the inflation shock, but we're still seeing home prices increasing faster than inflation overall. When you then look at rent specifically, it's even more dramatic. So this purple line actually shows asking rents for new buildings. So that surged way up during the peak of inflation. We've actually seen asking rents nationally, I'll get into this a little more, be in deflation for a little period. And then overall rents, which are not just new buildings, but kind of over time, we're seeing, we had a big rent surge. It generally trails inflation overall. It peaked and now is coming back down, but again, is still running above overall inflation. We're also seeing changes in vacancy. Vacancy is essentially the way that price changes in apartment buildings, right? It's only when you put a unit out on the market and no one rents it that you then drop your price. That's in practice how you see rents change. And the way to think about vacancy is it's similar to the labor market. When you get a really, really low unemployment rate, that's when you start to see wage pressures, and that's why you can start to get that wage inflation spiral that we always hear about in the news. And it's similar for housing, that we got to really, really low vacancy rates in the peak of the inflation surge. And as a result, you're seeing that real big surge in rents. We've slowly seen that increase, and now we actually have higher vacancy nationally than we did at the peak of the pandemic in 2020. And so that has helped put some downward pressure on rents overall. We're also seeing a huge geographic variation. So what you'll see in blue here, these are actually places where we're seeing rents dropping, and it's mostly concentrated in the Sun Belt, where we had a huge building boom recently, and then we're seeing a lot stickier rents here in the Northeast as well as the Midwest. And you'll notice here in both DC and Baltimore, we are still some of the metros with the fastest rent increases, where the rent inflation has been stickiest, whereas what you're seeing down here in the Sun Belt is actual rent decreases. That's deflation. And you can see here again another graph showing it. Purple dots, those are cities in the South. So a lot of them were actually seeing this deflation occurring. And up here in the Midwest and the Northeast, we're seeing stickier inflation. And Austin, which obviously is an example I'm sure we'll talk about later, kind of this pretty extreme case that's had a huge building boom and is seeing pretty dramatic rent decreases. That's after a big inflation surge they had. So what we've also just gone through is a massive apartment building boom. As we were coming out of COVID and that inflation was hitting, developers took the price signals and started building a ton. As interest rates have come up, we've seen that kind of crash down. But we're basically back at kind of the overall pace of apartment construction that we were at before the pandemic. But we're basically just coming off of a massive supply increase. This is essentially a graph of not just supply, which to Patrick's point, you're not going to see the full picture. You just look at supply. You have to look at both supply and demand. So what we see here, the black chart is actually measures of rental demand, and the green bars are measures of supply. So this chart is actually showing, we look at it as kind of a supply versus demand imbalance. And when you get up here, we have demand surging past supply. And again, this is where 2021, 2022, we see that huge surge in inflation. And now, even though after that huge building boom, we actually have this huge new supply coming on the market. That's all that apartments that were built over the last few years. But we're also seeing demand surge back up again. And so as a result, we're seeing rent inflation be a little stickier than we hoped. But you have to kind of look at both supply and demand to understand where prices are going to go. So in DC specifically, some of you may know that back in 2019, the regional governments all got together, all the local counties, to try and come up with their plan overall on housing supply. And they focused on 3 targets. The goal is overall unit count to be added to the region, focus on accessibility, making it focus in high activity areas and near transit, and also setting affordability goals. The goal is to make 75% of the new housing affordable to low and middle income households. And you can see DC was leading the pack in the region in terms of overall housing produced. We were much faster than our neighboring jurisdictions overall. And that specifically is in multifamily, right? So the blue chart here is multifamily development. The yellow is single family. So you had some of the outer suburbs that were adding a lot of single family homes. DC, of course, we are adding multifamily specifically. And also when it comes to affordable housing specifically, dedicated affordable housing, we were setting the pace for the region. So overall, we were 60% of the way to our target, whereas a lot of the other jurisdictions were way behind their affordable target specifically. DC did announce last year that we met our overall goal of market rate units, 36,000 units produced within that 2019 to 2024 time period. But of course, as I was showing in the other graph, we know that we're still seeing some challenges with rent inflation. And in the affordable market specifically, we're now in the midst of a very big crisis of unpaid rent. And that's a whole other story. But essentially, we're seeing a challenge now, especially in low-income housing, of surging rent delinquencies, which has put a lot of affordable housing projects on the brink of foreclosure. So there have been some policy changes the DC Council's been working on to try and roll back some of the pandemic-era reforms that were driving a lot of those issues. But overall, we're basically heading into a foreclosure crisis for dedicated affordable housing in the city. And so we're really at a moment of uncertainty of what's going to come next. So now switching gears, I want to talk specifically about the math behind affordable housing. So the truth is it's actually not as complex as it might seem. New buildings, it's just like when you go to buy a home, it's a combination of using debt and equity. So if you were to go out and buy a home, you know that your equity is just a down purchase. It's the money you save for, your down payment, and then you take out a mortgage. And it's similar in construction. You usually would go out and you'll raise money from investors to provide equity, and then you'll take out a loan, a mortgage on the property. So the way that equity investment works, if you're buying a house, you're raising that money on your own, saving up for your down payment. Usually when you're building a building, you're going out to third parties. You're going out to institutional investors, and they're going to go and compare, if I put money into your project, what else could I be spending my money on? And so the easy answer is you could just go buy stocks in real estate companies traded in the public market. The overall return we've seen, the overall return we've seen there is about 13% in recent years. So if I'm going to take that money and not put it in a liquid stock portfolio, I'm going to put it in one building where it's much higher risk, you're going to look for a much higher return. So generally, you're looking for about institutional investors looking for 18 to 20%, because again, in finance, the basic idea is you need a higher return to compensate for the higher risk. There's a little bit of a discrepancy. You can see larger projects, you need a much larger investment. So you're usually going to much more sophisticated investors who are doing much more detailed analysis. And smaller projects, sometimes you're raising money from friends, family, and they might be a little more willing to take a slightly lower return because they're not quite as large, kind of sophisticated Wall Street types. On the debt side, it's pretty similar. You get a mortgage to buy a home, and when you're building a building, you take out a mortgage. Again, construction is higher risk than just owning a home. There's a lot that can go wrong during a construction project. So usually construction loans, you're going to have higher interest rates. Banks are going to have recourse provisions to claw back, and also guarantees that the borrower has to take out. And so usually banks overall want to reduce their exposure. Banks are in the business of risk management. And so usually they'll actually limit the total debt to roughly about 60% of project costs. And then when the building is built, sometimes you'll refinance, you'll pay off that construction loan and take out a more normal mortgage, or you'll sell the building and use the proceeds to pay off the mortgage. But of course, if you can't make your debt payments, you have a risk of foreclosure. That equity gets completely wiped out. And of course, real estate compared to other sectors of the economy, because it's so reliant on debt, you get a lot of volatility in the business cycle. And so real estate tends to really be a boom and bust industry compared to other sectors of the economy. So to show you what that looks like, this is something in real estate we call sources and uses. It's what your sources to pay your costs are on one side, and then what all your costs are on the other. And obviously, your funding sources need to equal your costs. These have to balance out for your project to be able to work. So they talked about you'll need to raise equity and debt, and then your uses are land value, as Professor Condon was talking about, your construction costs, we call it your soft costs, your design and permitting, legal costs. You'll need to keep reserves in order to keep the building operating, both reserves during construction and then long-term reserves to pay for any rainy day funds, essentially to pay for any deficits you have during operations. Developers don't do this for free. Developers do need to have revenue coming in as well. So usually there'll be a developer fee in the project as well, just like you'd pay a architect fee or a contractor fee. The developer will make money from a fee. And then finally, you have your financing costs, which I'll get into more detail, which is what we call the cost of capital, which is, again, that return on the equity and debt that is needed in order to make that financing work. So here's an example, a hypothetical 100-unit building of what that might look like. Your overall project costs, you might say it's about $10 million for land, depending on where you are. Your construction costs for that will be about $27 million. Probably about 10% of that will be your soft costs, your architect, permitting fees. You keep about $2 million in reserves, and the developer fee would be about $1.9 million. So overall, your project costs for this are about $44 million, and then that's going to be paid by about $18 million equity, $26 million in debt. So I mentioned cost of capital. Here's the cost of what that would look like in practice. If we're talking about this 18% return that you need over a 2-year construction period, that equity is going to cost you $6.9 million. On the debt side, if we take out a $26 million loan, we're assuming 6% interest rate, your interest costs during that period are $3.2 million. So overall, your cost of capital for that project is $10 million. So what is that? That's overall general construction. What does that look like for affordable housing? So the emphasis here, to keep things simple, I'm going to talk about rental housing specifically. And the key thing to understand about dedicated affordable housing is that your rents are capped, right? They're set. As Professor Condon was talking about, it's dependent on how you relate to the area median income. And so usually we're talking about rental housing that's capped for folks that earn 30 to up to 80% of area median income. So low to moderate income households. And that affordability is usually enforced by a covenant that's put on the property that demands the use has to be restricted to people making those incomes. So the really key thing to understand is these units do not earn enough of a return to make that math work that I was just talking about with equity and debt costs. And so as a result, you're not able to attract those equity investors, and you need to figure out a different form of equity. On the debt side, because you have lower rents, you're not producing as much income, which means you can't make as large mortgage payments, which also means you have smaller mortgages than a regular market rate project. And so the really key thing to understand is really you need government subsidies or philanthropic dollars to make up that difference. So let's see what that looks like. I'm again assuming the exact same $44 million cost for building the building. We're talking about the same 100-unit building here. But here we're talking about a hypothetical building where the rents are capped to folks who make 60% of area median income. As I mentioned, you're not going to be able to earn enough a return to attract any equity investors. So right now you're sitting on $0 in equity, and your debt is not actually at that 60% level. Based on the income that you'll be able to produce from these rents, you're only able to take out about $16 million in debt. So that means you're short $28 million to build your building. So in affordable housing development, we talk about filling the gap. That's really the core of what we do, trying to find the funds to make this work. There's traditionally 4 big federal funding programs for affordable housing. Traditionally, we had public housing. As you can see, that's been in kind of a long, steady decline over the last few decades. We have project-based vouchers where HUD pays a rent subsidy directly to the building. And then we have the main program that's really surged over time are low-income housing tax credits, which is similar to the tax credits that were in the Inflation Reduction Act passed recently. Tax credits are essentially a credit that companies receive on their corporate taxes in exchange for making an equity investment in affordable housing. This was created in 1986 by Congress, and as you can see here again, it's now surged to become essentially the largest federal funding program for affordable housing. And the basic idea is investor will give money to the project, they'll get a 10-year corporate tax write-off in return. And the idea is then you have some sort of self-enforcing mechanism that the investor wants to make sure that the developer plays by the rules, and so they enforce the project directly. So in a typical tax credit deal, that will produce, it's based on your costs overall, and I won't get into the complex formulas, but that will get you about 13 million. And so that means you're still short 15 million here. And another challenge with tax credits is you can only use them if you have bonds from the local agency. And so as the tax credit program has surged, the demand for bonds has surged as well. And now most states are starting to hit the limit. They only have so many bonds they can issue. And DC is one of these places now where states are getting oversubscribed on their bonds, which means we've eventually hit the total federal cap on these tax credits. So what are some other tools that cities can then use to fill this gap? As I mentioned, we're still not all the way to closing the gap. One form is a capital subsidy, where the city would make an upfront one-time payment to help cover these costs. The other are operating subsidies, where you make ongoing long-term payments. The thing about a capital subsidy, you're paying it upfront. It can be through a grant, it can be a revolving loan fund. The example we have in DC is the Housing Production Trust Fund. And the basic idea is you're giving an upfront payment in exchange for affordability long term. So an example that we would have here, the city would give another $15 million loan from a Housing Production Trust Fund, and now you finally have a balance and you can move your project forward. The other way you can do it is an operating subsidy that will be attached to the building long term. Vouchers are the most common one, but also property tax abatements. These are usually your two main forms of operating subsidy. In both cases, that increases your income. You can take out a larger mortgage, and so as a result, you reduce your gap that way. We do have local examples as well, a local rent supplement program, as well as a specific tax abatement for projects using LIHTC. And so an example here where you have the operating subsidies, let's say the city is giving a little less money in capital subsidies, but because they've given the operating subsidy, you can now actually go up to a $21 million debt. And again, you've now closed your funding shortfall. So there's pros and cons to each of these. When you have a one-time payment, obviously it's less long-term financial pressure on the budget. Technically, from a public finance perspective, it's actually more efficient. You get kind of better bang for your buck, and you do have some opportunity to recycle funds long-term if it's a revolving loan fund. The benefits of the operating subsidies is A, you don't have to come up with a really large pot of money up front if the city doesn't have it. So it can be easier to budget for. And it can also help you reach people who are at really low income levels, who those rents still can't even cover the cost of operating. I'll go through this very quickly, but just one key takeaway here. There's basically three phases of construction. Pre-development, which is when you're doing all of your design, your permitting, you're trying to line up your funding. You have your actual construction phase, and then you have what's called stabilization, where you're leasing up, trying to get your building full and operated. These are all riskier than just owning a regular operating building, but they basically descend in order of risk. This is, of course, the most high-risk period of all. You're paying your architect. You have no idea if the project's going to go forward. And so that's when usually you have to take out very, very high-interest loans, and your capital to fund this is very, very expensive. For market rate projects, that can take a year, 2 years. The key thing to understand for affordable, because it takes so long to line up all these funding sources, it's many more years. So we're talking 3-4 years to make all that work, and that's one of the greatest challenges in the industry. Obviously, construction, which is still very high risk. Things can go wrong during construction, not as high risk as pre-development. It's not different from affordable or regular, so you're talking year and a half to 2 years. And then stabilization is the one period where you usually have an advantage in affordable housing. There's obviously such huge demand for affordable housing that it's usually easy, and you can lease up your building much faster than a market rate building. And then once you get to that stable phase, you have a stable operating building, you can refinance and essentially close out the project. Some emerging challenges I'll touch on very, very quickly because I know I'm short on time. Insurance is a huge, huge issue right now. There's a recent cover of The Economist that this is essentially our next great challenge in the world of housing markets generally, that we know that the economic impacts of climate change are going to be channeled through the insurance markets. And as a result, we're already seeing them go haywire a bit. So it becomes really hard for us to plan and budget for. We also have a lot of city fiscal constraints. No news here in DC, of course, but when you have falling office values, you lose property taxes. When transit system ridership goes down, you have higher operating deficits. Aging populations mean there's lots of pension cost pressures. Obviously, we're in a higher interest rate environment, which means larger payments on the debt. And so the reality that we're living in now is we don't have as much public money as we used to, and we have to become a lot more creative about how we generate tax revenue. The other thing I want to point out is we just lived through a very unique period of very, very cheap capital as a result of the aftermath of 2008. So we had a period where interest rates were incredibly low, which was part of what was helping to inflate home prices and land values. And obviously we are out of that now. And there's really no indication that we're going back to that. So we're in a kind of great adjustment period right now of trying to get used to a cost of capital that is much higher than we've had in 15 years. So the key things to take away overall, we have seen inflation slowing down, but it's still very sticky. We have seen supply cooling, but we still have high demand. And so we're still getting this long-term challenge of prices. When you're talking about construction finance overall, the key thing you're understanding is the challenge of getting high cost equity, and you need a robust bank lending system in order to work. For affordable housing, you need subsidy programs. It's the only way that we can get our projects to move forward. And then finally, because these projects have long timelines, they have a lot of risks, stability and predictability are incredibly important for making them work. And of course, right now we're in a brave new world, a period that I call kind of a great reset in affordable housing development. So it's a tough time to be in the business, but hopefully we'll come out on the other side of it. So thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, our final speaker is Yona Freemark. He is Principal Research Associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. We've asked him to help us better understand what is happening in the affordable housing space in Washington, D.C. and across the country. Please welcome Yona.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I don't have any slides, so you'll just have to use your imagination while I speak to go through. I do have my little red book, so hopefully I'm able to follow that in a way that makes sense. So I'm going to talk today primarily about the housing economy in the United States overall. There'll be some mention of affordable housing, but not in any sort of detail like you provided about the exact way that financing occurs. But maybe we can talk about how that intersects with Professor Condon's conversation and mine during our Q&A. So I want to start out by saying that from my perspective, as somebody who does this research on a day-to-day basis, I do believe there is a housing shortage. The high prices that we experience on a day-to-day basis in the housing market are reflective of a housing shortage. But it's important to emphasize that when I say housing shortage, the housing shortage is not evenly distributed. That is to say, places like Vancouver and Washington, D.C. have very high housing prices, but other parts of the country do not have nearly as high as housing prices. Obviously, Vancouver's in Canada. Other parts in Canada have lower housing prices as well. It's also true within neighborhoods, as we're very aware in Washington, D.C. Single-family homes that you buy in neighborhoods west of Rock Creek Park cost considerably more, of course, than single-family homes in neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River. That is a difference in housing costs that's worth thinking about as we think about the housing supply shortage. It's important to emphasize that the housing supply shortage is an indicator of demand. It suggests that people with more income are more interested in living in some areas than other areas, and there are a number of reasons why that might be the case. One might be the economy of a metropolitan region is higher performing than the economy of another metropolitan region. Another might be that some neighborhoods are more attractive. They have better funded public schools. They have better amenities than other neighborhoods. Others might be historic animus against people with low incomes and people of color. But all of that results in a reality that we're facing in many different communities throughout the country, that there is significant problems of housing supply shortages in the most in-demand neighborhoods. And that's the thing that has motivated the conversation that we're seeing all around the country and actually in different parts of the world about housing supply. It is to say, people want homes in certain areas and not others, and they feel frustrated that they cannot afford them to a significant degree. So what can we do to address that? Is that something that we can go ahead and solve really quickly? So one thing I would say that's worth just thinking about in general is that housing costs are admittedly partly or even to a large degree a factor of the ability to pay of higher income people, people who are going into purchase new homes and rent homes, especially people who are purchasing and renting new homes on the market, who are in the higher income range of the society. There is, in fact, an extremely strong association between the rise in incomes that occurs in a metropolitan area and the rise in housing values and rents. In other words, as metropolitan areas and neighborhoods become places that people with higher incomes want to live in, the market rates of those housing units adjust and become more expensive over time. And there's a good reason for that. If I own a house or I own land, I can get somebody to pay more for that home or land, I will do that. I will get them to do that because I want to make money on my property. So of course, as people's ability to pay goes up, as their incomes go up, the house prices will go up over time. And so it is definitely true that when you look across the country, housing markets with lower incomes also generally have lower housing prices. That's not surprising at all. And it's also worth pointing out that metropolitan areas with the highest rates of housing growth often have, unfortunately, higher housing growth. The markets with the highest rate of new housing construction often have high housing growth as well. However, all that said, it is also fundamentally true that, from my perspective, as somebody who studies these numbers on a day-to-day basis, adding housing matters in terms of preventing as high of housing costs as we might expect. So income is very important, but when I've looked at it, when you add more housing per new resident, you get lower rents and lower housing costs overall. And this is really important because it suggests that even if housing costs overall are too high and are going up, one way to marginally reduce that increase in housing costs is to add new homes. Now, this doesn't mean that these new homes are going to be enough to make our city affordable to everyone who wants to live there, or our neighborhoods affordable to everyone who wants to live there. But they will play an important role in improving the marginal cost of housing. Now, when I've studied this, I haven't just looked in the United States. I recently did a study comparing conditions in the United States and France, which I've studied extensively. And one thing that's really interesting about France and the United States is that they are both developed countries, but they have gone in very different directions when it comes to adding new housing over time. France has added significantly more housing, 2 times the rate of the United States over the last few decades in terms of number of new housing units per capita over that period. And what you see is that while in France, there has been a dramatic decline in the number of people per household, even adjusting for changes in the demographics of the population. In the United States, there remains very high rates of crowding and other problems related to too high housing costs. And from my perspective, what that suggests is that there's clear evidence that if you are to invest in significant additional housing, you will see benefits not only in housing costs, but also in terms of other benefits related to housing, like people being able to live in the amount of space that they want to live in. Now, it is true, Professor Condon's example of Vancouver is instructive, but my counterpoint would be to suggest that for every Vancouver out there, there are places like Austin that have added a huge amount of housing and have also seen significant declines in housing costs during this period. It's also worth emphasizing that when we've done studies of this using causal methods at the Urban Institute, where I do work, we have found that additional housing is associated with reduced housing costs, perhaps again, not to the degree that we desire, but still significantly. New housing is important. And this is especially true for new affordable housing specifically. So I think everybody in this group believes that new affordable housing is a good idea and additional affordable housing is a good idea. but we need to be thinking about affordable housing within the realm of the overall housing market. So how do we get additional housing or additional affordable housing specifically? From my perspective, land use regulations, zoning can play an important role. So right now, in cities like Washington, D.C., the zoning system is designed in many ways to enforce certain historic problems in our society, starting with historic segregation by class and race. It is unquestionably true that when you look at the zoning that's used in Washington, D.C., many areas west of Rock Creek Park are zoned at a very low density, which has made it impossible to add units for diversity of residents to live in. It also has the result of concentrating affordable housing in areas where zoning allows affordable housing to be built. When I did a study of the Puget Sound, which is the Seattle region, what I found was that affordable housing was concentrated in just the 5% of the whole metropolitan region where multifamily housing was allowed to be built. Much of the rest of the region where only single-family homes were allowed to be built had virtually no affordable housing that was actually built in those areas. And that suggests that if we want to ensure that affordable housing is available everywhere, we do need to think about changing our zoning standards, our zoning rules, to allow that affordable housing, along with other types of housing, to be in every different sort of neighborhood. All that said, affordability remains a major problem. Even if you add in a lot more housing, you're still going to have a major problem with affordability, especially with people who are under the upper middle class. And this is true in virtually every high-performing metropolitan area, even in Vancouver, as was suggested, but also in places like Austin. So Austin saw some decline in housing costs, but remains deeply unaffordable for people in the middle and lower classes of the economic spectrum. So my perspective is that we need to be thinking about adding additional housing supply from the perspective of meeting an overall need of additional housing, but also think specifically about additional tools to bring in more affordable housing. So from that perspective, I think perhaps we're all on the same page that the public sector really matters on this front. We need the public sector to invest more directly in housing, even in the current fiscal circumstances that we find ourselves today. But we also need better use of our publicly owned land. Unfortunately, throughout DC today, we have significant amounts of publicly owned land that is really underused in terms of the density that we could be developing housing on it. And I can think of that density in a whole bunch of different ways. But we have libraries, we have police stations, we have fire stations where we're slowly thinking about redeveloping. But those should be redeveloped tomorrow, frankly, at high densities all over the city if we want to bring in additional housing. And one of the big reasons for that is because reducing land costs can do a lot to reduce the cost of affordable housing production. I think Patrick pointed out that the land cost, that acquisition cost at the beginning, actually it constitutes, 20% or more of the cost of developing an affordable housing unit? If that's the case, if we can bring down the land cost to zero, if it's a publicly owned piece of land, you can make a huge difference in terms of the number of overall affordable housing units that are built. So I want to sort of end my brief discussion by talking a little about Professor Condon's contention that land costs absorb all of the sort of value that we put into the land, right? You pointed out there were two examples of parcels in Washington, D.C., one with a house on it, one with no house on it. They were the same value. My contention is that it is absolutely true that land costs go up when you account for added density. In fact, I did a study on Chicago showing that when you densify neighborhoods, when you allow additional housing to be built in a neighborhood, you will see an increase in land value associated with that. But I also contend very strongly against Professor Condon, and we can get into this in Q&A, that the land costs do not increase nearly to the level of the added density that's allowed by changes in zoning. Okay, and let me just explain what I mean really quickly. My contention is that if you take a piece of land that originally allowed one housing unit to be built on it, and you change the zoning for that piece of land to allow 2 housing units to be built on it, my contention is that the empirical evidence suggests that the value of that land will not double. The value of that land might go up by 5, 10, 20%, depending on the circumstances, but far less than going up by 100%. And that's a huge difference, because if the land value does not increase to the level that the zoning has allowed the increase to occur, that means that eventually when new units are built, those new units can be at a lower cost. And that's actually what we see in cities that have allowed duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes to be built. Those individual units are less costly than the single family homes they typically replaced. Now, it's also worth emphasizing that one thing that's really important to think about when it comes to home values is that the predominant explanation for housing costs is not the supply of housing, but rather the demand for housing, as I described at the beginning. Think about when I said, housing costs are really related to income. You can see that in the case of Washington, D.C. extremely clearly. This city went from doing pretty well in the 1950s to suffering from a very significant economic collapse that reduced home values dramatically, to experiencing quite a revival since the 1990s. And that has, with it, taken home values like this. That suggests that demand is a relation to income, of course, to a large degree. But this suggests that I think that when we think about land values, we have to go far and beyond just what's built on the land, but think about the demand in the market overall for the housing units that are over there. Now, all these disagreements said, I do think that there's some exciting ways to think about changing our policies to accommodate additional housing and to do so in a way that actually benefits affordability. So one of those is something called a land value tax, which I think has a lot of potential to encourage people to use their land more effectively. Another, as I pointed out, is to use public land to the greatest degree possible. Another is to link transit improvements with housing. And finally, in total agreement with Professor Condon, I absolutely agree that when you increase density, you should absorb the benefit that you're giving the landowners. And that is a huge potential out there. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A and hope this could be a good discussion. Thanks.
Well, thank you. All 4 should be on the stage in a minute here. Vince, I think we're pretty close to the time schedule we wanted, so you can take certainly a half hour here if we get the questions. People should line up at the, in addition to the questions that Vince has, you should line up at the microphone. So.
So I thought that was fascinating. I'm really grateful for our guests. I feel like I learned a lot. I heard some conflicting things. And so I want to get to that, and I want to give everybody an opportunity to ask some questions. I think I'll start by just getting to, for us locally, I think everyone has seen, and Patrick's presentation mentioned it, the mayor of the city set a goal of 36,000 new housing units in a 5-year period. And she beat it, or the city beat it. Now, a question I would ask for each of our speakers is, did she do that by just increasing supply? Just straight up, just build as much as possible, which I know some of our speakers would approve of. Were there other factors at play? Was the fact that we lived through that period where money was relatively cheap, and the district for a while was coasting on the fact that Housing Production Trust Fund had a lot of money in it, so there were easy options. My question for each of the panelists is, how did this city build almost 37,000 new housing units in a period of just 5 years in this city?
Okay. So I think the answer is a mix of different policy strategies. One was the decision to engage in large-scale rezoning in some key development areas. A huge share of that additional housing occurred in the Navy Yard, in Noma, and along the Southwest waterfront, because essentially the city was able to take advantage of land that was frankly significantly underused, rezoned for quite high densities, and attracted significant market demand in association with significant interest from the public to live in this city that was able to benefit, the investors coming in to build. But also there was very substantial investment from the city in affordable housing directly.
I can add that the real main reason it happened is because DC was part of the nationwide construction boom that just happened. It was market forces at play mostly, that you had, a surge in inflation, which is the signal to the market to produce. That's not unique in housing. We had a surge in lumber prices, and sawmills ramped up production as well. And so what happened is we were not on track to meet that goal as of 2020, 2021. And then because you had a combination of surging rents and low interest rates, there was a huge construction boom that has now completely crashed. And so it is true that 12,000 of those 36,000 units were targeted to be affordable. And the city did a pretty good job, as I was showing before, beat all of our peer counties by a lot because we were putting a lot of public money and other tools in and doing zoning changes. But the truth is it was market forces at work, but that was markets responding to the price signal, which is just, same thing when oil prices jump, oil companies drill more.
I like to keep it simple. The number 36,000, I see that all over North America. Those huge 5-figure numbers, 6-figure numbers. The derivation of those numbers is supported by some methodology that's grounded in a canon of supply and demand. So that's number one I want to say. So the other thing I have to continue to say is that I have to go back. Vancouver is an exceptional example, but it's not uncharacteristic. It's very like San Francisco. It's very like Washington, D.C., where the land prices end up being, on average, we're not talking about immediately after zoning or in the context of some discussion between a tower and a 6-story building. That's a particularity. But in general, in places in North America where they build a lot of housing, those correlate with the places in North America where housing gets more and more and more expensive. The big bubbles I showed, the charts I showed, were I should have mentioned before, 50-year data. And Vancouver provides what's called a longitudinal study over a long period of time to test the hypothesis that adding hundreds of thousands of new units into a city that's much smaller than Washington, D.C., since the 1970s has had the odious result of leaving the city with the most unaffordable housing that there is. I don't want to go on too long because maybe later in the question period I can give some clues about why my book really presents something very different than these lovely younger gentlemen to my right and left are saying, without really criticizing the facts that you've presented. The logical underpinnings, though, of these arguments, I hear a lot, and I believed for a long time, because that's why I participated in helping build the city with 200,000 new housing units. But it didn't work out. So that's what my book is about, trying to explain why.
Okay, thank you. Hold on just a sec. I got a couple of quick questions, rapid fire, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience, and I can't wait to hear everybody's questions. So just hold tight. The next question. Yeah, if you all, we'll recognize you first. We'll recognize you first when we get to questions. Second question, and this, you may be at a disadvantage, Professor Condon, but for our three speakers, in the district, we have something called the Height Act, which limits density, limits height, and by extension, limits density. What can each of you address what your thought is on the value of eliminating the Height Act in this city to increase the supply of housing, of both affordable housing and just housing stock?
I can give a one-sentence answer and turn it over to others. We have the same debate. Height will give you affordability. Vancouver's famous for it. You know, I showed you the pictures. Height will give you affordability because more density on the land. That changes the underlying real estate dynamics. If you limit the height, it doesn't end up that the buildings, that the product that you have limited to 8 stories rather than 50 ends up costing more per square foot. It ends up costing about the same per square foot. So that's a demonstration of how decisions around what kind of building you can build in a particular location really informs the market, because a 6-story building is going to still sell for $1,000 a square foot kind of thing in the market, because that's the value of the real estate. All right.
One thing that's interesting about building heights is that you're right that as building heights go up, they don't necessarily have the proportional reduction in cost per unit because of the higher cost of construction necessary to build higher. This is certainly true. I mean, you will hear some green movements in Europe, for example, that are opposed to towers because of that reason, because the increased energy costs required to build skyscrapers is substantial. I'll also say very quickly that, you know, one thing about the Height Act that has historically been to DC's benefit is that DC may have, maybe even beyond New York, the least parking filled downtown in the country, which is great. And I think part of the reason for that is that the Height Act helps spread the downtown a little further than it would have if the Height Act had not been there. If the Height Act had not been there, we probably would have seen taller towers in the center and maybe less development at the edges of what's downtown today. And so that's a great thing from my perspective. However, where are we today? The concern that I have, the biggest concern that I have with the Height Act is I'm worried about the office market in Washington, D.C. and its potential redevelopment into neighborhoods, a different city in the future. We have, obviously, this very built out downtown. Most of it's at the height limit, right? And most of those buildings can't be easily converted into residential for a number of reasons, right? Because the block size in DC is enormous. Nobody wants to live in the center of a giant structure. The buildings themselves are just these huge monoliths that make redevelopment really difficult. And with the Height Act there, the incentive to replace those buildings with new buildings that might be better suited for residential is a lot more difficult. The Height Act would, if you got rid of the Height Act, in theory, you would be able to encourage additional replacement of some of these older office buildings that are very difficult to redevelop today with more financially feasible, taller residential buildings. I acknowledge that this is very stressful for people of this city who love the Height Act, but you know, if we're worried about the future of the downtown and the ability to attract a mix of uses, I think that we should be considering the future of the Height Act.
I think what
Sounds like people disagree.
so one thing I would mention, most of the city is not subject to the Height Act. It's local. I mean, not it's subject to it, but it's the local zoning that prevails. So usually when we're looking around, downtown is kind of a unique example, but most of the time it's really a question of what the local zoning allows, because it's usually a lower threshold than the Height Act. And the one thing I just want to add about the land value question is I do want to mention, land values fluctuate wildly. It's kind of a really key thing to understand about the economics of land. It's not static, right? Like obviously it depends on where you are. You can add a lot of density in a small town in West Virginia and you're not going to change the value of the land because there's no benefit to building it higher if the demand isn't there. But land values also fluctuate with the business cycle. It's just the nature of the math, all that math that I was showing about financing costs and all that. You get a small change in interest rates. Usually the math is about 1 percentage point of interest rates, from mortgage rates go from 6 to 7 or from 6 down to 5. That can make your land value fluctuate by 20%. So what you see is basically a roller coaster of land values. In boom times, land values surge way above existing building values. And then in bust times, like right now, they fall below it. And when you're in a bust, if the math doesn't pencil out that you can't build a building, you can increase the density all you want. It's not going to change the land value. So it's business cycle dependent, and land is very, very volatile.
Great. One other quick question, and then I really want to hear from the audience. Each of you, well, let me start by saying, I recently came across a book called Why Nothing Works by Mark Dunkelman. I've not read yet, but what I understand the thesis to be is that in part we, American society, and progressive notions of growth, controlling growth and planning, we in some ways have created problems for ourselves. And I'd be interested in hearing from each of you, because you had different theories as to how we could do a better job creating housing. How much of it do you think is simply self-imposed policy decisions by our mayors in New York or Boston or Washington, D.C. or any other city in America where we've created so much red tape or processes that add to cost, add to complexity, and make the process of building new housing more expensive than it ought to be. And I wonder if each of you can address that really quickly.
I want to go first on that one. Just last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, a new study from the National Economic Institute, I might have the name wrong, that comes out of the Federal Reserve, said that they could find no difference in looking at scores of American cities in either the cost trajectory or the supply that was a consequence of differences in either highly democratic situations where neighborhoods are very involved. That's not true of every city, or other cities that didn't have that legislation or process or culture. So that's a very important new study that tries to answer that question exactly. And the answer was it didn't make any difference. That the policy difficulties, going to the public hearings and people with the gray hairs coming out, it didn't seem to matter. It didn't seem to matter.
Interesting. Okay, great. Patrick?
Maybe on this for a minute, I'll talk specifically about affordable housing. Obviously, it's the world I live in. I think there's a good intention with affordable housing projects to try and make them perfect. And it's, if the city is funding, which as I mentioned, you basically have to do to make dedicated affordable projects work, they have more ability to influence, and attach to conditions. And I like the term Ezra Klein came up with for this, but he talks about the challenge of everything bagel liberalism, which is you have all these goals, right? You want to have local hiring requirements, local business use requirements, more aggressive green building goals. And it's quite similar to actually, what the Biden administration was trying to do with the CHIPS Act, with the Inflation Reduction Act, is adding all of these additional conditions onto the funding, which the goal was it would be a kind of a win-win-win and make everything work together. But the challenge is when you burden all these projects uniquely with these requirements, so affordable housing has to jump through all of these extra hoops that the market rate projects don't. What happens is you actually get less affordable housing as a result. And so it's definitely, I'd say, a huge challenge in the city, and one that I think we're probably in the moment for a little bit of a rethink about. If we want to produce more affordable housing, we have to make it doable, and you can't rely on affordable housing developers to be kind of superheroes navigating this Herculean labyrinth of requirements.
That's an interesting point to bring up is the fact that we have a differential set of what regulations we expect for different types of providers of services or of units. It's a strange consequence, I think, of a sort of compromise that liberals in cities have decided on, which is that they think in general that a capitalist market is acceptable, but also we want to achieve these more progressive ends. And so we try to achieve the progressive ends, but by sticking everything in a corner. And then we wonder why it costs more to build an affordable housing unit than it costs for a private developer to build a market rate unit. I think you're absolutely right that one of the challenges we run into is the complication. I'm not convinced that we should get rid of the regulations, but rather that the regulations are complicated, that they are unfairly distributed. Like, why should the regulations only apply to affordable housing and not to others? But I think more generally, we should be more willing to be proactive as public sector actors directly. I think one issue that the United States faces and has faced for many decades, since the 1970s, is an unwillingness of the public sector to assemble the capacity necessary to invest in projects itself. Now, unfortunately, I'm sad to say that this government right now is destroying the public sector capacity of this country every single day. And the result of that is that it's going to be even more difficult for the public sector to do the things that we want it to do. But I still think our cities have the capacity to do things like lead on development. We should be further encouraging the ability of WMATA, for example, the metro, to build on parcels around its stations. We should be encouraging the city to invest directly in affordable housing. And in that way, I think we should be giving those public sector actors abilities that go beyond just the private sector system that we usually rely on.
Well said. Thanks to all our guests. Now I really want to get as many questions as we can before we break for the evening. Please make your questions concise. I want to hear from our great guests as much as possible. So go ahead.
The name is Lester Cuffey, native Washingtonian, former advisory neighborhood commissioner for the Mount Pleasant neighborhood. And I'm glad I'm the first lead-off speaker because I think we have to have a serious discussion. The discussion itself within the context of America and within the context of capitalism. These two gentlemen, number one, there's always that debate about housing and the cost of housing, supply and demand.
Please ask your question.
Okay, there's always that debate. Second, what do you think, wait a minute, what do you think of the current status? What's the current status of low-income tax housing given the Trump administration? That's number one. Number two, the Trump policies as of right now, their policies are talking about cutting back on affordability, cutting back on outreach and so forth. And number three, because I'm a Washingtonian, rent control. What are your thoughts on rent control? In this city, and I've been here empirically for 40 years, there was and rent control came from a Republican administration, Nixon. We didn't have the problems that we have in terms of affordability until the city pretty much put loopholes in rent control. When I came here, I'm gonna finish. When I came here and walked the streets of this library, I saw nothing but homeless people. And all of us are like a mortgage away from homelessness. So to sit here and, because the debate about housing in the context of capitalism, that's always been the effort. So if you can answer those three questions in a real serious way, then we'll have a serious discussion about housing and affordability.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great question.
Well, I think there was a lot of questions there. I'm going to try my best to answer at least some of them. When it comes to the Trump administration's policies, the low-income housing tax credit so far has been relatively under-discussed, which I think might be a good sign for the future of that policy. In fact, there are a lot of Republicans in Congress who want to actually expand the tax credit for low-income housing. So maybe that policy will remain or even expand. The biggest concern I have with the Trump administration when it comes to tax credit projects is that a lot of the tax credit projects rely on some of those additional funding sources that Patrick pointed to, like programs called HOME, CDBG to help with pre-development, Section 8 to assist individual people. And I'm very concerned the Trump administration is going to cut those additional subsidies, which is going to make LIHTC projects more difficult to build and ultimately make them less affordable, because those additional supports, home and Section 8, help people with low incomes or very low incomes actually afford to live in LIHTC projects. That's number one. Second is rent stabilization, rent control. It's not my particular area of expertise, but I can say that my colleagues at the Urban Institute recently just released a study last week, and their conclusion on rent stabilization was as follows. They said that rent stabilization has been associated with somewhat of a decline in overall housing construction, and I mean nationwide, so less housing, but they also find that it's associated with more housing stability and more housing availability for people with extremely and very low incomes. So there is an interplay at there that I think maybe with some good policies, we could come to a compromise in a certain way between building more housing and rent stabilization.
This brings up a point to reiterate. My book spends a lot of time on the tax credits and Section 8. And under present political circumstances, they should be expanded, not contracted. But each one of them has a problem. Section 8 provides money that feeds into the landlord system, which in a way also elevates the asset value of those properties. Also, the tax credit, I did a tax credit one, and it was in 1985 in the city of Westfield, Massachusetts. I'm very proud of that project. Unfortunately, that project is now lapsed beyond the 30-year period, which constrained it. So I guess the presumption was just building it and getting affordability into that structure would last forever. That's why they weren't bothered by the 30-year limit, I guess. I don't know. That seems like crazy to give away tax dollars for something that ends up being private property after a long amount of time. I mean, it has to do with how you adjudicate that 30-year value, whatever. That's a political question. I just think it's way more elegant to do it the way that if you're gonna add density, just do it the way Cambridge pioneered, by just saying if you're gonna do density, it has to be affordability, full stop. And that, you mentioned the influence of 1% on the land value. No one ever talks about public social benefit requirements as also being a means by which you could lower those land values. That affects the land price residual too. And in a way, you want the land price to go down because you don't want it to go up. That's what's pricing out people. So anyway, that's my whole point here tonight. And it's a very not often presented point, but the point that I'm presenting here tonight is the target ought to be this land value. And the way to shrink that land value is to insist on some social benefit as a consequence of the new development. Now, the argument comes up, we're not gonna build anything. My experience is property turns over once every 30 years. So there's a flow of like 3% of those properties come up for sale. And there's going to be a market value for that land, essentially. The building maybe, but mostly it's about the land, if you agree with my hypothesis. When it comes up, that's your opportunity. It gets sold for what the market is at that point. And if the market is influenced not only by financing costs, but by the social benefit required as a condition, it's called conditional zoning. And it's been approved by the U.S. Supreme Court as well as Supreme Courts around at the state level across this great land, that it is okay. It's an execution of the police power, which was established in the 1920s, Euclid versus somebody, saying local democracy has the authority to insist on certain social benefits, one of which can be affordable housing. As our responsibility for protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the community. That's what happens at the local level. And the most important thing that happens at the local level is authorizing what happens with land. People don't own land, they own rights to land. That's true of every government, no matter how capitalist it is. You don't own land. What you own is the right to use it, and the government protects you from having your home invaded by someone who doesn't have the right to it, you see? So it's all about government protection of rights. And we established those rights. And my frustration is that we don't really bring that question to bear on this issue of housing affordability, where it is technically achievable to do a much better job of preventing money that's just going into land value, instead of it making somebody rich, make the community richer by insisting that there be a degree of affordable housing as a consequence of our zoning activity. Full stop.
Thank you.
Just very quickly on that, because I know we want to get to the questions. I agree with that idea. I think the trick is you have to model it, right? Like, to make the math work, you have to check the math. And unfortunately, land values do change. It depends on all those inputs I'm talking about, what your construction costs are, interest rates, and it changes constantly. And that's one of the biggest problems we have. If you want to try and capture that benefit, you have to have someone with the skill to do all the modeling and do it constantly, because it changes constantly depending on what construction costs are, interest rates are, rents are. And so as a result, you have to create a whole government capacity mechanism in order to do that. It's not as easy as just like coming up with a number.
That's entirely true. And my 33 years of experience in Vancouver are stunning. It rewired my brain, because especially during the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, they were very capable of understanding what was happening in the land market. And the planning department was entirely up to speed on that one, and negotiating differently every year based on the factors that you have mentioned.
Great. Let's try to get more questions. Thank you for your patience.
Yes, this one should start with Mr. McAnaney, please. There's an affordability crisis generally, but an affordability developer crisis with $250 million outstanding because of COVID regulation and no collection by developers of affordable housing in the district. That's an emergency, I think. A lot of them are going under. I don't know how your firm is faring. If we can't build based on developers, we're in trouble. Can you give me a paradigm that would include a fix to the money source? We're having money source problems in order to build affordable housing. What can we do with social housing, which would be, workforce, low income, and then market rate solution for social housing as a solution? Can you name social housing as a market solution to the problem you overlaid this evening?
So the biggest challenge right now with people not paying rent is you can structure kind of any project, right? Whether it's a company that does it, a nonprofit does it, a government agency does it. You need to get income up to be able to support debt. And when you have a rent non-payment crisis, as we do, banks don't want to lend, period. And so that's kind of the challenge we have. Is it's not a different model that changes. You basically just have to we have to rebuild the social contract. We have to get people back paying rent again in order to make properties work and be solvent. And then there's lots of room for experimentation with different models, but it doesn't matter what the agent is doing the development. If you don't have rent collection, you're not going to have banks lend to anybody, period. And so nothing is going to work. So we kind of have to go back to first principles here, rebuild the social contract, get rent payments back up to a stable level, and only then are we going to have new affordable projects of any variety going forward. I know that's not getting on the social housing question.
Let's move quick because there's a lot of people in line.
Professor Condon, thank you very much. You mentioned that the public creates a lot of value in land, streets, good schools, transit, zoning permission. All these things create value in land, and we allow the private landowner to appropriate that publicly created value. And that's the fuel for land speculation, which is a parasitic activity which basically makes money off of the public's benefit. And Yona, this question is really for you, is that in places like Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Pittsburgh, they reformed their property tax by reducing the tax applied to privately created building values, but increasing the rate applied to publicly created land value. That tax shift allowed Pittsburgh to be a very vibrant economy with affordable housing, which is almost unheard of. They also made the transition from a manufacturing to a service economy better than the other Rust Belt cities, in part because land speculators couldn't afford to speculate on land. Just wondering if you're aware of that and if that's an appropriate example, something that we might emulate here in DC.
Yeah, you're talking about a land value tax, right?
I call it land value return because if you say land value tax,
All right.
say I don't like tax.
Land value capture is a better way to talk about it. I'm going to try to get this into 60 seconds. There was a guy named Adam Smith who said that there's three factors of production. They're labor, capital, and land. And he says labor and capital participate to create capital out of thin air. They create value. That's the beauty of capitalism. But he says the problem is most of that value, in his observation, ended up going into the price of rent of the land. That's essentially what is happening now. So a land value tax was his recommendation, Henry George's recommendation, a bunch of others, Stieglitz, still alive, his recommendation, that in order to keep that from happening, which is land is parasitic on capital function, you should tax land. I wish we had done that. Henry George died in the United States when they were debating the new tax structure that came at the end of the progressive movement. They shifted to an income tax instead of a national land tax. Terrible thing. We do have a land tax. It's typically the local tax, but the unfortunate part is it's usually less than 1% of the value. In order for it to have the kind of effect that Henry George and Adam Smith and a bunch of others have said, it'd have to be over 10%. So you'd have to increase local real estate taxes, prioritizing the land side of it. Forget the building, prioritize it. But you'd still, in order to have that economic effect, you'd have to do it by 15%, up to 15%, or 1,500% increase in your local tax bill. I don't want to run on that platform. I don't think I'll get elected on that platform. So
Okay.
That's
basically why I suggest the moment of rezoning is where you can basically tax the land lift. It's that moment that is practical.
I could just quickly say that, I agree with you. If you want the full effect of a land value tax, you would need a massive share of the taxation base to be coming from, very, very high increase in taxes. But I do think that there's evidence from a number of American cities that a land value tax, even at relatively small levels, can play an important role in changing the development system and helping to encourage more housing development, especially on marginal parcels. What the land value tax does is it discourages developers or property owners from holding on to land for a long period of time, using it for things like surface parking lots, nothing uses. And it encourages them to put a money-making use on that land, in other words, housing. And so I think that there is some benefit to land value tax, even though it is not going to, of course, solve all of our problems. And I agree, we're not going to increase it to 10% of value.
Okay, thank you, Yona. So 4 more questions. If each of you can keep your questions tight and ask one question to one panelist so we can get through the last 4 speakers and break for the evening.
Perfect.
And tight answers as well, please. Tight answers.
So in terms of density and land value, my question is, do you think it's just density, or is it the fact that anything that creates an amenity in the whole area, including the value that a lot of us have of living in a dense area, is what raises value. So I would ask that to Yona and ask a quick clarification question to Patrick of District of Columbia, as opposed to of British Columbia, about whether Austin was metro area in the data that you showed versus central city, because Patrick of BC was clear that his was central cities. Thank you.
Very quickly, I think, the evidence suggests that most of the value of property is resulting from people's demand to live in a community, which results from a whole variety of factors. As I noted, their incomes, but also what is in the community, which is to say, like, does it have the retail people want? Does it have the schools people want? Does it have the aesthetics people want? That said, it is also a product of what the supply of housing is in that community. So the housing cost, in theory, and the land cost should incorporate all of those different issues.
The clarification, it was all metro area, and anyone can look up that data. It's on apartmentlist.com. They do a monthly rent report.
Thank you. Tight question, tight answer.
Hello, how are you doing? My name is, I go by Solomon. I'm a local community activist. I put forward one of my volunteer think tanks group's ideas for the downtown area with a combination of the voters and some of the building owners that I've known for quite some time, and came up with a consensus for us to, just have a stipend to our new structure, like you were saying. And I think that it might be good if some of the affordable housing became more profitable, because you're dealing with people that are dealing with micro problems, not macro problems. And perhaps through Department of Employment Services, which is very overfunded. I deal with a lot of funding. And public works. These are all mutually, not mutually excludable products that we already fund, and we could probably offset some of our losses as citizens or whatever.
Give us the
And I just
question.
wanted to know, what did you think about some creative ways, like you said, Waimata, and some of the ways to do stimulus with job training and being able to make the units a little bit more profitable for some of the investors, being that we have a downturn in occupation and the supply-demand ratio is kind of a little bit off, like you were saying. Thank you.
Okay, who wants to take that? One of you. Or we can just get back to him.
There's definitely a lot that we need to be doing downtown, right? And so there's a lot of different programs, I'd say, that the city's trying to roll out. It's still definitely a work in progress, but I think we all know that we need to transform downtown and get it working to be an engine for the whole city long term if we're going to be able to invest in all of our other needs and projects across the city.
Thank you, Patrick. Yes.
My name is Hussein Musabi. I'm talking to you about my own experience in my own neighborhood I live. I live in Washington, D.C. for 45 years. I pay taxes. I see the same similar houses in my neighborhood. One they sell, for example, $700,000. It's similar houses that come the next. I'm talking about supply and demand. It doesn't make sense at all. If one house is still $750,000, the next house, the similar house to come, they raise it with $900,000. This is real estate agents that do it. We have to do something with the real estate agent. The price of the property, they go higher, higher, higher.
Sorry, could you ask the question, please?
My question is, two questions I have. One is
One
for-
question, so we can get to the woman
Okay,
behind
for
you. One question.
affordability, we cannot raise the salary of everybody, but the government can make offers to lend people with a lower interest, they can buy houses. And my point is, the supply and demand in the market, it doesn't mean any time price goes up, they say market value went up.
Okay. Thank you.
I think you might be essentially describing processes of gentrification in neighborhoods that are occurring throughout the city. And in essence, Washington, D.C. has experienced perhaps the fastest rate of gentrification in any U.S. city over the past 20 years. And there are a number of reasons for that, starting with the fact that it's just attracted an incredibly educated, high-income population. And the result is that when investors go into neighborhoods, they can purchase homes change them up a little, add a nice kitchen, add a deck.
Change anything. Similar houses, $750,000. Next house come to $200,000 extra.
Right,
This is real
exactly.
estate agents, they're robbing the
And
people.
right, and that process is occurring fundamentally because of this extreme demand that the city has experienced from wealthy people to live here that allows them to afford that $950,000 versus the $750,000.
But if it's that true.
Okay,
But
we need to
one
wrap.
question I have,
It's,
but
it's okay. There's a reception after. You can speak to him after. I really want to get to this last call, last questioner.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. I'm so sorry I'm at the end because I have a bunch of things. I represent the.
Limit it to one question, please, and then we can talk
I'll
after.
do my best. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, then I'll sit down. Should I?
Okay, yeah, sit down and we can talk after at the reception. Well, just ask one question. Yeah, but some people are ready to go. So
You don't want to hear me? This gentleman does not want to hear me.
that's fine. You can talk to her after. Ask one question.
Okay. I represent a community west of Rock Creek Park. And what I would like to say is, I think anyone who wants to change the single-family zoning west of Rock Creek Park is going to have a very tough sell. So among the people I represent, they have a number of questions. For example, to some of my neighbors, the photographs that, sir, you presented of Vancouver would be absolutely horrific. There wasn't one tree visible in some of those photos. So some of my neighbors would like to know, with all this infill housing that you want to put in, why does every community have to look and be the same? Why can't there be diversity of communities? Why can't there be some single-family communities mixed with multifamily communities, some higher income communities with some lower income communities? Why give away public, you mentioned, sir, that you think we should give away more public land for housing. That means that there will be no public land for public uses for the people who already live here. Climate change and green space, where developers have redeveloped in Chevy Chase and elsewhere in west of Rock Creek Park, there's a dramatic reduction in the number of trees and green space. Livability and quality of life for the original residents are all being affected by this extreme density. And many neighbors have been talking about moving. And you're going to be forcing single-family people out of the city into the sprawling suburbs or semi-rural areas. And I would like to know from you, what is wrong with having a diversity of communities? Why does every community have to be the same? You're talking about infill housing in every community, and my neighbors would like to know about that.
There's nothing wrong with it. I'm a new urbanist, and that the principle or the canon of that has always been that there's a range. The American landscape provides a range, a transect of different kinds of neighborhoods that perform different kinds of services. Probably too many single-family home neighborhoods out there, but that's what we got, and there's going to be a lot of them forevermore. My whole point is really simple. We are now talking about, as a consequence of what's considered to be a housing crisis, we're attacking it with the assumption that the crisis is formed by not allowing density to go pretty much everywhere. I think it's very crude kind of dialogue, because obviously there's going to be very different densities everywhere. And my whole point is that I do not believe that if your whole intention is to enhance affordability, if that's really why you're doing a whole bunch of stuff like eliminating local hearings, all kinds of things are happening here because of the broad scale assumption that that will lead to more affordability. And unfortunately, I don't think so. That's my whole book. is trying to make the case that there are policy ways that we can take the Cambridge example again. Rather than finding taxpayer subsidies, we could, if we wanted to put $2 trillion into it, supply housing for everybody who needs it at 30% of their income. But that'd come out of the tax revenue. The alternative to that is to figure out a way to use the levers of zoning to insist on social benefit. That's why I say don't just upzone hoping for affordability, insist on it.
Well, I want to thank, on behalf of the Committee of 100, all our panelists and Vince. I mean, there were not a lot of new faces in the audience. Hopefully, you can get involved in the Committee of 100 going forward. You can carry this conversation on in the lobby, and we have plenty of food out there. So please enjoy that. And thank you for coming. Once again, thank you to all our panelists.